Yep.
Okay, cool. And I'm Dr. Murder. This is the block from Shabbos, Daf Pei Tes Amid Aleph. We are up to the Pei Ches Amid Beis. I'll just quickly remind you, we're talking about the Mishnah where a woman got married based either on the testimony of a single aid, and then the husband reappears. Then, of course, she has to leave the second husband and so on. Rav made a cryptic comment, which we explained yesterday, and then Shmuel made another comment, which also, if there were two witnesses, then she has to leave, but then it's not her fault. She didn't do anything wrong. She can go back to her first husband. So now Shmuel made a comment and said, this is all talking about if she did not contradict the testimony. In other words, she got married based on the testimony of a single aid, and then she did not contradict the second testimony. But if she would have contradicted the testimony of the second pair of witnesses that come and say, hey, you did something wrong, she doesn't have to leave. So Gemara is trying to understand what exactly are we talking about. Here we're talking about that two people came along and said, this is not that your husband is still alive. Who cares if she contradicts or doesn't contradict? He always follows the two witnesses, and she has to leave the second husband. So obviously we're talking about a single witness came along afterwards and said, hey, that man that you claim your husband is dead is actually alive. So we say if she contradicts the aid, fine, then she doesn't have to leave the marriage. But if she believes him, then she has to leave the marriage. So we brought in Ula. And this is Ula makes a very important point. He says that whenever the Torah says we believe a single witness, we give him the credibility, then it has a full credibility as if the person has two witnesses. So it's like two witnesses said their husband died and she married, and now comes along a single witness says your husband's alive. Why would you worry about the single witness? Who cares if she contradicts him or not? It's one against two, and you always believe the two, obviously. Now, but there's a big machlekes Rishonim when Ula's rule that one aid has the valid credibility of two. Is it a rule, generally speaking, whenever a witness comes along and says anything, if it's a single witness is good enough, that this is kosher, that they have the credibility of two witnesses, and if another witness comes along afterwards and says, hey, it's not kosher, we ignore that? Or is it only generally where the Torah wants two witnesses, and we relax the law on a certain, certain exceptions? We say, one witness is good enough. Like here, for women issues, you always need two witnesses. But for Aguna, we want to help her out. That her husband died, so one witness is good enough. Only in this case do we say that one witness has a credibility of two. But in all other cases, a single witness is a single witness, and therefore one against one. Anyway, we're up to the Gemara here, about 12 lines, which is talking again, 14 lines to the bottom. The first word line is Shel Echad HaPeiches HaMebeis, and the fifth word is Hachamais Kinan. The case that we're talking about over here is that when Shmuel said it depends if she contradicts the second aid or not, it's talking about Psule Aedis. We're talking about that there were possible. So one aid came along and said, a single aid came along and said, your husband is dead. And right, we accepted that. And then came along two apostle witnesses, like relatives or women or something like that, that apostle, generally apostle witness, came along and said that your husband is definitely alive. And we followed up Nehemiah, which seems to argue with Ula's rule that we just said before. The Tanya Nehemiah says, he says that when he says a single witness does not have the credibility of two, he's just a single witness. And then so wherever there's a single witness, doesn't really have the full credibility of a witness, just a general. That means it makes sense. Probability, this is what happened. Could he have a witness? So then even false witnesses, not false, even if apostle witnesses, qualified witnesses come along, relatives or women alone come along and disagree with him, we'll look at the majority, because it's all a question of probability, not so much a question of credibility, and by a single witness. Also, will treat two women against one man, just like two men against one man. So in other words, it comes along here, is actually in the beginning of Mitzvah, there's a big machlekes Rishonim and Achronim, when one single aid comes along and says you owe $100, you have to swear. Does what kind of credibility does a single witness have? So here, according to this version of the Gemara, a single witness is not really testimony. It's more like probability. If somebody says that, probably that's what happened. So if probability, then if even two apostle, we look at the majority, and if two apostle aides come along and say it didn't happen, that probability is that it didn't happen. Comes along in Bamari, but another version to understand. But so therefore, in this case, it depends what she believes. The woman, if she believes in her heart of hearts that her husband is dead, she doesn't have to follow the majority, because nobody can force her to. It's her avera, and she says, "I don't mind. I don't believe it's an avera." That's one thing. Or, but if she doesn't contradict, then she has to leave. The Baisim, another version is no. That really we do follow Ula that the single witness has a credibility of two. If one witness comes along first and we accept the testimony that, let's say, the husband is dead, like one witness. And what happened is that it was a woman who came along in the first place and said that your husband died. No, if it would have been a single kosher witness, I agree with Ula that the credibility of two witnesses. Here, the first witness also was a disqualified witness and said that your husband is dead. And and the teacher of Nehemiah Hachi, this is how we can learn of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah says, whenever the Torah says you believe one witness, you follow most opinions. In other words, if the first witness is someone that generally would be disqualified, but in this case, because of a guna, we believe it. So then it's not really testimony because the apostle witness is more case of probability. So then, then we say, look, where's probability? Then two women, I would say, more believe than one. So therefore, probability that you believe the second group. And therefore, two women against one woman is like two women. It's like two men against one man. But if it's two women against one man, which almost the first came along a man who is there as an aid, and then came along two women who is there as probability. Then palga, it's like half and half. And we already said, no, it's like one against one. We already said whoever comes first, if the first aid came along and was accepted, had the credibility of two. So the second group, which is one against two, is not acceptable. So it's very interesting that the idea of Aedis is not a logical thing, probability. The idea of Aedis is that this is a halach in the Torah that two people believe in this case or one here. And that's why, as the Rambam points out, Moshe and Aaron, most believable people in the world, yet if they both come together, they're not considered two witnesses. They're only considered one. So witnesses is not a question of probability. It's like a gzeres hakosov. And apostle witnesses tell us something. It's more a question of probability. So therefore, we do accept testimony from disqualified witnesses, but we treat it as a logical thing, as probability, rather than as a fact. So then we have to probe more into it and see that actually what happened. Okay, says more further. She divorces. She needs if this is what happened now she was discovered that her husband was alive. She needs a get from both, from them and them. And then first of all, it said, I understand. You need a divorce from the first husband because she committed adultery. She married a second guy based on a single witness, and she shouldn't have, right? Fine. But the marriage to the second one was a sham because she was a married woman. So nothing happened. So why does she need a divorce from the second husband if she never got married to him legally? Just nus. Okay, it's not a fault and everything else, but the fact is that it was on his nus. We're worried. People are going to say, people will make wrong assumptions, say, what happened here? It comes out, they thought when she married the second one, they don't know all the intricacies of what happened. They think, well, obviously her husband's alive. She must have been divorced from the first husband, married the second one, and now suddenly we see she just walks out scot-free. People start saying, oh, look at that. She's a married woman. She married the second guy legally, and now she just walks out without a divorce. People will make that mistake. Says then safer. So how come it says later on? The Tani it says Amrullah. They told him Mezbailach. The next mission which we have learned, they told her husband died, and she didn't get married to a second guy. She just got engaged. When this got she got engaged, and then the husband suddenly reappears. Muteres Lazla. She can go back to the first husband because she didn't actually live with the second man, so nothing really happened. She can go back for her husband. Now it sounds like she doesn't need to divorce the second husband. If you're worried about appearances, what do you think people are going to say? When she got engaged to the second guy, people assume she was divorced from the first one, and then they see she just walked out of it. So then what are people going to say? You don't need a divorce. If you're engaged, you don't need a divorce. Why aren't we worried that people will say, this person, the first husband must have divorced her, and then she married the second one. But comes out a married woman. She got married, engaged from the Torah to the second person, and she walks out without a divorce. Why aren't we worried? Sigmara said, who told you that in the case of engagement, she doesn't need a divorce from the second husband? Maybe she does. Maybe when our Mishnah says she needs a divorce from both, it refers also to the next Mishnah, which talks about she merely got engaged. She doesn't need a divorce. Says so. Nimtza comes out. Mission is arsa. I have another question. If we're talking about there was a divorce, comes out that she got married to a second guy, got divorced, and she went back to the first husband. Doesn't the Torah say that once you're divorced, you now once you marry another guy, you now come back? Says the Gemara. If you remember, we had a Gemara a long time ago. With the Gemara, we had an argument if she merely got engaged, Is she allowed to go back to the original husband? So this Mishnah will follow. Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur, the Amar is sorry, skip the words. Into the is that one that comes out of this person is taking back his former wife. Mishnah is asked after he got engaged. Answer the Gemara. Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur. The Mishnah agrees with Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur. The Amar says, "Men anasuyin asura." Once she married somebody fully, she cannot go back to the original husband. But Mina Ada says she really got engaged. Nothing happened with Tedis. So the Gemara is still not happy. So the Gemara Hamiktani Sefer, it says in the Sefer, Afal Peters later on, even though she nosul achar get, let's say she got engaged, and the second husband gave her a divorce. Since there was no reason for the second husband to give a divorce because she was a married woman, turned out to be. So then, the rule is that if a woman got a get, even if the get is not a real get, it's only the Rabbanah said, for looks, for appearances, give her a divorce. It's called reyach get. Anything that smells like a divorce, she can no longer marry a kohen. And yet the Mishnah clearly says if the second husband gives her a divorce, it's like nothing happened because she was never married to the guy. She was a married woman to the first. So the get is just an empty piece of paper, and she can marry a kohen. And you just said that he has to give her a divorce. You just said that if got engaged to the second husband because of appearances, she has to get a divorce. That should disqualify her from marrying a kohen if you're right. Says the Gemara. So tell me, how do you understand the end of the Mishnah where it says get? If the second guy gave her a divorce, like pasim and you rule that does not disqualify guna, which means McLeod the loy boy you get. That means he doesn't need to get it over the second husband. Not even going through the charade of having a get. Nothing. The boy get, if the law would be for whatever reason that she needs a divorce from the second husband, then Amayla Pasman Kuna, why doesn't disqualify from Kuna? The moment you have it smells like a get, she's disqualified. Ella, even Chalitza, for example, don't do with get because it looks similar to a get, she's disqualified. Ella Seifa, you're right. You're right. She does not need a divorce from the second husband. So we want to know why not. Why are we worried about appearances? Why, if she got married to the second guy, we say, you know what, get a divorce, even though you really weren't married. But if you're merely engaged to the second guy, you don't need a divorce. What's the difference? People will talk. What's enough? Amri, people will make an assumption that Kiddushin Toys have it. The whole Kiddushin was a mistake. They'll think that the person said, like Rashi learns, I'm a Kohen. Turned out to be he wasn't a Kohen, he was a Yisrael, he was a Levi. So therefore they'll say that she got engaged to him on false pretenses, and therefore why would she walk away from? She didn't even get married. Can't even say there's a problem of Shalom Bayit. He didn't even get married. Why did she walk away? It must be there was something wrong with the whole engagement. So people, therefore, are not going to automatically assume that you don't need a divorce if you're engaged. So why can't we say the same thing that if they were married and suddenly they're divorced? People will say, you know why they're divorced? Because it was a mistake. They found out the whole thing was a mistake. So also in the beginning, why do people automatically assume that they don't need a divorce when you're a married woman? People will say, why are they divorced? Probably something was wrong, that the whole marriage was based on some false premise. Gemara says, I'll tell you the difference. Konsua Rabbanan. Gemara says, you're right. In the first case of the Mishnah, because she married a person when she was still a married woman, we decided to penalize her and say, you know what, you need a divorce, and now you can no longer marry a kohen and so on. New Sefer Namli, so why when she got engaged to the guy, don't we do the same thing, penalize her? She got engaged to somebody, she should have moved homework to see whether the husband's alive or not, and therefore she should also have her to receive a divorce. Says the Gemara, I'll tell you the difference. Of the Surah Konsua. In the beginning, she did an Aveda. She was a married woman and she married another guy. She's living in sin, even though it's not her fault, but she's living in sin. So therefore, they penalize her, you need to receive a get. Say for the love, this sort of merely she got engaged to another guy. She didn't live with him or anything else, so no Aveda took place. Like Konsua Rabbanan. Rabbanan did not penalize her. By the way, if there were Pralov, who used to be the Rav in the yeshiva, so he wrote a sefer called Get Ma'usa. And in his introduction, he writes there the most difficult things in his life. They set up bezdins all over Europe after the war to try to help agunis, because a lot of the people that nobody knew they're alive and not alive, and you have these men and these women who they were married and they have no idea if their wife is still alive or the husband's still alive and so on. So they would sit there and they would record all these names, and they would call people in and give testimony of all the people that they would share the camp with, that they saw them die, so they can have a list of all these people, so that you help out these men and women that they should get remarried and so on. And he writes the most difficult part was when he had a few cases where people were told that their wives passed away, or wives were told that their husbands passed away or were killed, brutally killed, and they remarried, and a couple of years later they suddenly find out that the husband is still alive, and meanwhile she has children from the second husband. And he writes over there, it broke his heart. People came in where the first husband would say, I'm Michael, nobody's fault, stay married to the second guy, you look happy, and the Bezdin obviously couldn't let them stay married, and it's totally not their fault. And Nebuch. So it's like the war continued for these families, or the Holocaust, and all the repercussions continued many years after the war ended. Anyway, second about further. Also, she got married, ain't look ksuba. She forfeits her ksuba. My time of why? To kill Rabbanan ksuba. What's the whole reason? What's the whole reason why Rabbanan gave a ksuba? Kadesh lete kalabein. Let's see. We want to make sure that the husband doesn't just every time he gets angry decides to divorce his wife and just throw out of the house. Rather, he has to rethink this will cost him a lot of money. To hate kalabein. Let's see. Here we want to encourage them to divorce. The second husband shouldn't live with her. We don't want the second husband to live with her, and therefore she shouldn't have a ksuba. So she should be happy to get out of that marriage. And Tesis points out that in the Gemara Ksubas is actually an argument from Meir and others whether Ksubas from the Torah or Rabbanon, and the Rabbanon say it's only the Rabbanon. But in the Ksubas it's written that when you write a Ksubah, you write the Ksav Zuzei Mason, that how much money you're entitled to $200, the Chezel Lechim Deraisa, that's suitable to you from the Torah. That's what we put into the Ksubah. And here the Gemara says that the whole idea of Ksubah is only with the Rabbanon. So Teresa says that many times we say we're talking here, either we're talking here about an almana widow, which is definitely only midrabanan, and therefore we're sort of giving a logic to the whole thing. Why the Torah would say it as well. She loses out all the dividends of all the property she brought into the marriage, even though he had no right to do the end. Soon he wouldn't even married, he can still keep, doesn't get it back. The lame is nor does it doesn't have to provide for her. The lay belows and all the things that she brought in, and even though the material doesn't take it back. Why? Because like everything, all the dishes of ksuba are just like the same rules of the ksuba. Not mizem, she took it on her own. Of course, she had no right to. Now I would have thought, even the tafsir, once she took it, it's her belongings. She can take it. She took the dividends back. It's hers. So therefore, maybe she can keep it. Kamashlan, no, she gives it back. Havlad mamzer. We learned that the child is a mamzer, and not only from the second husband, obviously, but even the first husband, he decides to go ahead and take her back. When we said Teitze Mezeh Mezeh, if the first husband takes her back, then any new children that he has is a mamzer. Says the Gemara, over there, ain't termin. Now we're going to bring a few different things here. We're going to try to bring an analogy to our case. Now, as we tell you not to do something, if you did it, what happens? We learned over there, ain't termin min hatame al hator. You're not allowed to give truma, right? You have a big field there, so you take some crop, which is tame, and you give that. And you say, this crop I'm setting aside, so it permits me to eat my whole field. My whole field is no longer tevel, and I'm giving truma tamei to the kohen. Now, why can't you do that? It's really only a midrabanan, because you're stealing, where Rashi and Tesis agrees, you're stealing from the kohen, because this is the kohen's food, the kohen's revenue is truma, and you gave him truma tamei, that all he can do is burn it, he can't eat it. So you're stealing from the kohen. However, the Mishnah says, v'im taram, if you did it, so it depends. You did it inadvertently without realizing it was tamei truma. So truma, it's a valid truma. The truma is valid, and your field is now you can eat. But amazing, you did deliberately loy asav like klum. You didn't do anything. What do you mean you didn't do anything? There's two parts. When you give truma, there's two parts. First of all, what I set aside, that in itself is truma. It's holy, has all the laws of truma, and that goes to the kohen. And the second part is that the rest of the field that you're giving truma on is now no longer tevel, and you can eat from that. So when you say that you gave truma tamei deliberately to a kohen, what do you mean like asur like klum? Two ways of understanding it. My asur klum. Said nothing happened, which means that even that little bit that you set aside for truma, that amount, is not truma. It never became truma because you didn't listen to the rabbis. It never became truma, and what it reverts back to tevel. So the entire field is tevel, and what you set aside is back tevel. Nasser Beisha says no. Means what you did, you did. The fact is you shouldn't have done, but you set aside truma to meya, it became truma. But the rest of the field is still tevel, you cannot eat it. But truma have it. It is truma. Why does Rav Chizda get away so that at least the truma became a truma? Because the Amrit have a truma, because he's worried if you're going to tell him that this little bit is truma, that people will automatically assume, well, this is truma, then obviously my field is all right. Because what do you mean? That people don't dissociate the two. They think that if it's truma, it goes hand in hand, that the field now is no longer tevel. So we are worried that the Posh of we told him to set aside again from this field, that he won't do it because he thinks that everything was done all right. Says the Gemara, so why is it different here? Why is it different than what we learned? Somebody said it's like cucumbers and itzas mora. Turned out to be that was unedible. That was inedible. What do you call it? Avtiach, a melon beneath itzas ruach was all rotten inside. So again, it's inedible. We're talking about Vinim Tzas. No, but this is not my mistake. My mistake, he gave Truma to a coin which was not really valid. Again, you're stealing from the same idea of the law. Except it's Tame, it's something wrong with the food itself. You're stealing from a coin. And the din is Truma, what you set aside is Truma. But the Yachz of Yitron. But you have to give Truma again on your field. So clearly it's a question of Chizah. We see that what you did is valid, even though it's not edible. Just that the field is still Tevel, and you have to give Truma on it again. So what's our Chizah saying? Nothing happened. So the Gemara Shege made the Karam. You're asking a question from Shege, from inadvertent to deliberate. Shege of a Yisura. When you do something b'Shege, you didn't do anything wrong. Right? In this case here, it turned out to be that it was rotten. But Mezi covered the Surah. But in the case that we're arguing about is where you took deliberately Truma, which is Tameh, and you set that aside. So in that case, we're going to say that there's no Truma happened at all. You can't ask me a question from a Shege to a Mezi. So okay, but I will ask you a question from Shege. Tony, here it says, it says it clearly, but you did Truma to me, you had no idea, then Truma is a Truma. Everyone agrees that the Truma is a valid Truma. And you don't even have to do again the field, everything is good. And yet, Hasam Tony, in the case of the melons, it says Truma, whatever you set aside is Truma, but the Yachz of Yitrim, you have to give Truma again on the field. What's the difference? So this is not a question of Chizah, it's a general question. When do we say that the Truma is valid and it's good enough for the entire field? And when do we say you have to give Truma again for the field? Says again, you cannot compare. Hasam Shegib Karlamate, in the case of the melons and the cucumber, it's negligence. It's much more than Shegib. What you do is look at it and see that or open one of them up, make sure that they're ripe and that it's edible. The boiler limit, we should taste it, and therefore we penalize you. We say, okay, the truma, but you got to get truma again for your entire field. But in the case of tuma, how are you meant to know? How do you know that it's tameh? It looks the same, and therefore it's totally not your fault, and the truma is a valid truma. Says, but okay, but Mezi, I will ask a question from one Mezi to another Mezi. Now, Mishnah about the case of Tameh, it says whatever he did, nothing happened. And yet, now we learned. If somebody gets truma, you have a potted plant. If you have a puncture under the potted plant, then it's getting its nurturing from the ground, then it's mahatayra, you have to give truma because it's considered like it's attached to the ground. But if there's no puncture in the pot, then we say mahatayra, this is not considered a plant. It's only rabbanon that we treat it like it's part of the land, and you have to give truma. So what happens? A pot that did not have a puncture. In other words, it's only chayiv truma midrabanan. You took from there some of the produce, and you said, "This is going to be truma on my field out there." The field out there is chayiv from the Torah to give truma, and you use something that's only chayiv midrabanan, and you say, "I want this not only to be truma, but I want this to be the truma for my entire field." Al nakub is truma. So whatever you set aside will definitely be truma. But the Yachz of Yitrim, we tell you, but now you have stuff to give truma on your entire field because this only Rabban doesn't work for the field. So how come we're not worried? How come we're not worried that we're going to say that this is truma, that he's going to think, well, I don't have to give truma the rest of the field. By Tameya, you said, Rabbi Chizah said, we are worried. And here we're not worried. What's the difference? It's very simple. Betray monotzai. Here it's two different pots. You have one with a potted plant with a puncture and one without a puncture. And you tell them, look, you took a truma from the one without a puncture. It's only rabbanon. You got it's a truma, but you got to give truma from another pot. That he can understand. It's two different pots. There's a difference between the two. He'll do it. If you do it on the whole field and you took out the truma tumeya and you gave the truma tumeya and you tell me that truma tumeya is a valid truma, but you have to do the whole field, he doesn't understand. It's the same field. Is it truma? Is it not truma? Therefore, people won't listen. The Gemara, okay, that's up here. What about let's focus on Nosab Rav Yosha? He's the one who said that the truma is a valid truma, but you still have to give truma again for your field. Now, what you still have to repair, you have to still amend, give truma for your field. But it's truma. Maishna, why is that different? Well, the case in the Mishnah we learned exactly the opposite. What happens? Min hanokov, you took produce from the potted plant that had a puncture, which means mahatayla, you have to give truma, and you had in mind al she'einokum on the other plant that did not have a puncture, which is only chayim midrabban. The din is truma say truma, it's a valid truma, But you shouldn't even eat the truma that you took in your hand. Don't eat from it. That what the truma you took from the plant of the puncture. You took a whole bunch of produce. He said this will be truma on that other part of the plant that had no puncture. Since the mahatayra, that other part of the plant, because it had no puncture, does not need any truma. This did not become truma. So therefore, you cannot even eat the produce that's in your hand, because it never became truma. It itself, you need to take truma from that. But why didn't it become truma? Because you took it aside in order to be mighty the other part of the plant, but the other plant is not chayiv truma from the Torah at all. So says the Gemara. So in the law of it is that, so it comes out that what's in your hand is not truma. How come in the previous case I've also said that it is truma? If you took Taman Torah, the truma is a truma, a valid truma, but you have to give it again. So how can you compare? Shiny hoch in this case here, the truma how you see. In the case of Tameh, the Torah recognizes if you took Tameh and you set it aside and you gave it to the Kohen, Mahatayra, it's a valid truma. It's the rabbis who said it's no good because it's stealing from a Kohen. But Mahatayra, it's a valid truma. It's only the rabbis that it's no good. So therefore we say, look, leave the truma the way it is because the Torah said it's good, but you have to give truma again on your whole field. Here, Mahatayra, there's no truma because you took truma from a plant that you need to give truma, and you said this truma is for that other plant that doesn't need truma, Mahatayra. So nothing happened from the Torah's perspective. So of course it's not truma what's sitting in your hand. Says the Gemara. Shani Hacha here is different. The Raisa truma is good truma. Rabbi Where did Rabbi say this? Rabbi said, and we had a whole discussion in Gemara Tamur about this as well. Rabbi said, "Benign, how do you know the Torah bin Arala Yafa? How do you know somebody gives truma from a bad crop to a good crop?" Said truma. How do you know the Torah says, "Look, you shouldn't have done it, but you did it. It's about truma." It says, if you did it, I don't want you to have to carry the sin. When you remove the best part from it. In other words, I don't want you to give bad truma. That says the Gemara, if you can tell me that nothing happened, then it says chedlam. What's the sin? If you tell me if you take bad truma, let's say truma tumeya, and you use that which is bad, cannot be eaten, and nothing happened, so you didn't do a sin. In fact, we have a machlekes abai v'rava. Whenever you do something that you shouldn't do, did something happen or not? And the opinion of them is that if you can tell me nothing really happened, then what's the sin? Another one says the very fact that you defied the Torah, it's the act rather than the outcome. But anyway, says he went further. So we can't from here now the Torah if you did it, the truma is a valid truma. So therefore, he said the truma from a truma tmei, the truma is a valid truma. Whatever you did in your hand is you did in your hand, and but the rest of the field is not. I'm not so sure. In the case of the Nakum, nothing happened. Says he went further. So Rabbi says, I don't understand. The truma is a valid truma, and you came along and he said, you know what? I don't care what the Torah says. We're going to cancel the truma completely. It's an amazing thing. The Rabbanan could come along and say, well, what the Torah said is not going to happen. And this brings in the subject we'll learn in the next couple of days, that the Rabbanan have the capacity to undo what the Torah says. It's an amazing thing. You say that Phila agree with that little bit of amount. Hadal is not even true. It goes back, reverts back to Tevel. My time, what's the reason? And you said it's only with the Rabban Gzeda. I'm worried. Dilma Pasha, I'm worried that you can tell them it is truma. They're not going to go ahead and give truma on the rest of the field. So because of that concern, you decided, you know what? I'm going to cancel what the Torah said. The Torah said it is truma, but I'm going to say it isn't. Me'ika midi, is it possible that when the Raisa have a truma, the Torah says it is truma? Dilma Pasha, because the rabbis are worried that people will be negligent. Afku Rabban l'chulun. The rabbis decide, you know what? We're going to take away the chulun. We're going to put it back and revert it back to normal to chulun. It doesn't make sense. Can the Bezdin come in and say, we're going to go against the Torah? How can that be? Malay Chizah says you can start bringing a number of proofs that yes, the Rabbanan have the capacity. So he says, don't you agree with that principle? But now I'll give you an example. We learned Havlad Mamzer Mizem. We lived in our case, the woman married a second husband, and then we told the first husband as well, don't take her back. And if the husband defied us, the first husband that took her back after she was divorced from the second one, we say any children born thereafter is a Mamzer. So Bishlam Mishani, I understand Mamzer, of course, she was a married woman. El Medishin, right now the Gemara thinks that when you declare that the first husband remarries her, the children are Mamzerim, the real Mamzerim, which means they can marry a Mamzeris. But the truth of the matter is, they're not a mamzer. The first husband's allowed to take her back. So therefore, because the truth is not a mamzer, that means from the Torah's perspective, this person cannot marry a mamzeris. And here you come along and you say, you know what, the child's a mamzer, which means he can marry a mamzeris. So the Rabbanan went against the Torah. Elamerishan Amai Ishte, it's his wife. We saw Malyu and he's allowed to marry her. He didn't do anything wrong. So and yet you say that this child, which is totally Yisrael, that this child is a Yisrael, is a Yisrael Malya, really a Yisrael. We did clear that this child is a Mamzer, and now he can marry Mamzeris against the Torah. Amalei, he said, you misunderstood the Mishnah. Also, Mamzeris, this child cannot marry. This child's mamash rachmanis. You're limiting who he can marry. He cannot marry a bas Yisrael because we declared him a mamzer. Nor can he marry a mamzeres because really he's not mamzer. It's only because the father defied our instructions. The only one he can really marry is after Yeris. Poor kid. He said, also mamzeres. So I might call him mamzer. So why are we calling this child a mamzer? Just to be stringent and to say he cannot marry a Jewish girl either. So therefore we're not going against the Torah. Rabbi Chizda once sent a letter to Rabbi Biyad Rabbi Acha Barabuna in the hand of Rabbi Acha son Rabuna to continue with this conversation. In other words, they had this conversation and then they separated, and Rabbi Chizda continued this conversation with Rabbi. And he said, you don't believe in this principle? They ain't Bezdin Master Lakadam. You don't believe in the principle that Bezdin can undo what the Torah says? But time we learn, let's say a person marries a girl, the father married her off, that she's his wife, Mahatera. But the father died, it's the wife or the brothers are married off. He's only married her abundant. Comes the age of 12, she can walk out. She can do meal. So when does the husband start? Let's say if she dies sometime during their marriage, when does the husband step in and say, okay, it's my wife and I can now inherit her? Beishamai says, Mishatamid become Muslim once you reach puberty, 12. Beisil says, Mishatichanas l'chuppah, as soon as they get married. Sounds like, we'll come back. It sounds like any age. Rabbi Lezer says, not enough chuppah, but they actually live together intimately. And then the Yosha, he inherits her. If he's a kohen, has to go to a funeral. And now she can eat truma on his behalf. Beishamai says, now we're going to analyze each one. Beishamai says, puberty. Let's say they're really engaged. She can already start eating truma and he can inherit her. The law is even an adult. If she got engaged to her husband, he cannot go to a funeral, only to be married. Ema, you're right. Beishamai says there are two criteria. Mishatamid become Masa, she reaches puberty, and V'tichan is l'chuppah, she goes to the chuppah. V'hachi ka'omlu leBeishamai, so Beishamai says Beisil. The Kamritu, you argue Mishatachon l'chuppah, so they got married and went to the chuppah. It's totally his wife. I agree with you, only provided she's 12 years old. Mahanya l'chuppah, the chuppah helps, because then she can no longer get out of the marriage, since she's a married woman. But if she's under 12, but any day now she can walk out of the marriage, then every day we're saying, you're sure that she's his wife? She can walk out tomorrow. Chuppah alone is not enough. Rabbi Lezer comes along and says, but she's both. It's not enough chuppah. You have to actually have intimate relations. Says the Gemara of Ha'omar Rabbi Lezer holds. So Hillel sounds like he says chuppah alone is enough. As soon as they have chuppah, even if she's younger than 12, she's considered his wife. Until she walks out. When she walks out, she walks out. However, Rabbi Lezer says once they have intimate marriage. So you might ask a question, and it sounds like even though she's not bas mitzvah, but Rabbi Lezer holds ain't ma'asek tanakum. Rabbi Lezer holds that the activities of a young girl doesn't matter. So Moses is right. Aim must say again. He also holds the two criteria like Beishamai, but he says it's not enough to have chuppah. You need both. We should tagdil vetiboil. She becomes an adult and to have intimate relations. Anyhow, what's Rav Chizda trying to say from all this? Ktani mias. We learn from here. Yosha, he inherits her now. The Torah clearly says that if a girl passes away, who inherits her? Her father or her siblings. And here the rabbis came along and said, you know what? We're going to give it to the husband. You're going against the Torah. So it shows clearly that you can go against, that Chacham have the power. So who inherits her? Her father. With Rabbanan, the husband inherits her. And yet we see that Rabbanan going against the Torah. So he says, well, the Gemara answers back, that's no proof. Because when it comes to money matters, there's a special law which says, Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker. There's a special law that says that Hefker, Bezdin, Hefker, which means that the Bezdin has the right to make your money, your possessions, ownerless. And therefore, they're taking the girl's possessions, making it ownerless. So there's no father. His father has no rights to it anymore, and therefore it goes to the husband. They're not going against the Torah. And how do I know that Chum have that power? So we're going to bring two psukim. How do you know that? It says that it says, Kol Asher. Ezra said when he came to Israel, he saw all these people intermarried, and he made a rule that anybody who doesn't come here very quickly and they divorce their wives, whoever doesn't make an appearance within 3 days. As came with the advice of the officers and the elders, everything they own will become ownerless. So we see the rabbis have that power. And then furthermore, who Yibagul Mikal Havela, he will be separated from the community, from those who came back from exile. Rabbi Lazar says Mahacha from the following pasuk in the Torah itself. It says, Eila and the Ashenocho, the following of the inheritance that Elazar Kohen Yeshua gave over to the Eden, the Roshei HaAvis and the heads of the families, Lamatas, Bnei Yisrael, to all the different tribes. So they acquired Eretz Yisrael on behalf of all these people. Now, what's the question? What do you mean Roshei HaAvis? What is the Roshim, which are leaders, and Avis, which are fathers? What does that mean? Elohim will tell you, Ma Avis, Manchilin B'nei, just like a father gives inheritance to his children, is Kol Mashiyich, whatever they want. Af Roshim, the heads of the community, Manchilin Nesra, that means the Dayanim, the Bezdin, has the right to give to the people, Kol Mashiyich, whatever they want. And the Rashba in Gittin of Lamavov explains why there's a big machlekes between these two psukim. How far do we say hefke bezin hefke? Is it only that they make it ownerless, but now who's it belong to nobody? Or they have the power to go one step further, not only to make it ownerless, but actually to transfer it to somebody else's domain. The first pasuk, Ezra, just makes it ownerless. The second pasuk is manchilim, that they can actually not only take it and make it ownerless for you, but they can transfer it to somebody else. Anyway, bottom line is we're not undermining the Torah. We just took his money away. Saying more further, Matamala, he takes her he goes to her funeral. The Torah says that who should go to the father? It's the rabbis who came along and said that the husband goes ahead matame. So how come? And he's a kohen. So since a kohen cannot go to his wife, how can the Rabbanan say that that we're going to tell this person that even though there's a father there who can bury her, you should go to the Levaya? How can you go against the Torah? The Gemara should have a mes mitzvah, because we treat this. The most of the fascinating thing here, we treat this girl as if she is a mes mitzvah. Mes mitzvah is someone that has no one to bury her, and therefore the husband should step in. Says, what do we know to bury her? Me having mes mitzvah, but Tanya, we learn the rule is Eza mes mitzvah. What's a mes mitzvah? Kosher ain't like kohen. There's no one out there, has no family, nothing. No one's there to bury her. How do we know? If you make a declaration, look, this person passed away, we need help. Ein zeh mes mitzvah. That's not called a mes mitzvah. So therefore, this girl over here has a father, siblings. It's not mes mitzvah. What do you mean your husband has to bury her? So you want to say the fascinating thing in the psyche of people. Hachanami here too. Even the loyalty, because the fact is that they don't inherit her. When they hear that she needs to be buried and it costs a few dollars, nobody's coming to her funeral. If they're no beneficiaries, they're not coming. So the husband, so she's now a mes mitzvah. So therefore, because the rabbi said that her money goes to the husband, by saying that, they made sure that she's a mes mitzvah, because if her family say, hey, why should we spend money on her and give tachrichim and bury her when we get nothing from it? So let the husband do it. And okay, so we'll stop over here. I will continue tomorrow in Mitzvah Hashem.